Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Before we do anything else, I have to do the housekeeping bit. So, if the fire alarm goes, it really is a fire. We're not having a practice. So everyone very calmly, there are lots of people here to help you, if needs be. We walk down the stairs, out of the front door that you came in by, turn right and right again to Chapel Row, where you will all be ticked off the list to make sure everyone's there. Nobody, I think, has a problem walking. If anybody does, we do have other things to help you with. Okay, that's the fire drill. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Martyn Whittock this evening. He graduated in politics from Bristol University and is now a freelance historian, columnist, and commentator. He has a particular interest in deep stories, the way in which history is used to frame modern identities. And recent books exploring this concept, Trump and the Puritans, 2020, American Vikings, 2023, and now the latest, Vikings in the East, from Vladimir the Great to Vladimir Putin, the origins of a contested legacy in Russia and Ukraine. It is his 58th book. Martyn is an experienced historical author and communicator of history, having taught the subject for over 30 years. Other of his books are Norse Myths and Legends, The Vikings from Odin to Christ. Martyn has acted as a historical and educational consultant to English Heritage and the National Trust. Let's give Martyn a big welcome.
Well, good evening, everybody, and it's great to be with you this evening. And as you've kind of picked up from that very generous introduction, kind of three things flowed into the writing of this book before we actually talk about the book itself. One was an interest in Russia. I graduated in politics, seems another lifetime ago now, in 1980 at Bristol University, where one of my degree specialisms was in development of the Soviet state. And I taught modern Russian history for quite a long time to A-level. And in fact, a few years ago, I had a book published on a history of the Soviet secret police, you know, that kind of alphabet soup of terror that describes everything from the Cheka to the KGB and its latest manifestation in the FSB, for example. So Russia has always been something I've been very, very interested in. During my teaching career, I also got very interested in early medieval history, which effectively is that kind of period of history from the end of the Roman Empire to the end of the Middle Ages, recognizing that all these things are artificial constructs. Of course, no one at the time knew they were living in the early Middle Ages, but you know what I mean. We need these bookends to make sense of our studies. Got very interested in early medieval history. Taught that at A-level as well, and also got very interested, particularly in Scandinavian history, the Norse diaspora, you know, what's not to like about Vikings, although I think at Lindisfarne in 793 they had a different take on that. But basically, I got fascinated by the Vikings, by the Norse diaspora, as so many people are, wrote some books on that. And recently, because of this, I guess, I've become very interested in deep stories, as you hinted then. The way in which we use the past to frame and define ourselves and who we are and what we are, it was ever thus, I suspect, but we do seem to live in a world at the moment where that does have particular turbulence and resonance, and the past really can come and bite you, and we've seen this again and again, and I think all of us recognise the importance of the past, the study of the past, but it is quite intriguing the way in which many modern conflicts and conflicts of identity are rooted in contests over the past. And so all those things kind of flow together in this the writing of this book, Vikings in the East, from Vladimir the Great to Vladimir Putin, the origins of a contested legacy in Russia and Ukraine, and also I think probably a contender for the longest title that ever got past a publisher's editorial department. But anyway, so I want to take us on a journey today to the East. Now, in Western Europe, we usually associate Vikings with the North Sea and the North Atlantic, Scandinavian fjords, attacks on monasteries and trading settlements. Things like Lindisfarne in 793, things like Alfred the Great, the burning of the cakes. That's another mythological issue, but I'll put that one to one side for now. These are deep in the island story. However, this popular image rarely includes the great river systems of Russia and Ukraine, the wide sweep of the Eurasian steppe, the far shores of the Caspian Sea, the incense and rituals of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the high walls and towers of the city of Constantinople. Yet for many Viking raiders, traders, and settlers, and we need to recognize this catch-all term Viking, which technically we really should call them the Norse, because Viking was something that you did rather than something that you were. You might have an aspect of Viking at one period of your life cycle, and then retire, get the girl, get the farm, and settle down. Viking was more of what you did than what you were, something of muscular free enterprise, as it were. But it's become the label of choice. Most of us know what we're talking about in that sense. We're talking about people that burst out of Scandinavia between about 800 and the year 1000, causing huge impacts right across northwestern Europe. So forgive me if we use the term Viking, although purists will say we really should be talking about the Norse, the cultural catch-all for everybody, rather than Vikings, these testosterone-fueled young men, and usually it was young men. But Viking is here to stay, I think, as a useful label. But for many Viking raiders, traders, and settlers, it was the road to the east that beckoned. And this was the Ostrovega, the Eastern Way, as it was known in Old Norse. So we're very conscious of the Vikings in the West, but today we're going to think about Vikings in the East. And these Viking adventurers founded the Norse Slavic state of Kyivan Rus, basically this area here between the Black Sea and the Baltic, between the River Don and the Volga here, and over here the Dniester. So basically this kind of area here, corresponding to much of what we now call Western Russia, Ukraine, and parts of Belarus, became the state of Kyivan Rus. And the Kyivan Rus are the people that we're going to meet a lot in this talk tonight. They became latterly entangled in the contested origin myths of both Russia and Ukraine. The Rus ruler, Vladimir, Ukrainian Volodymyr, often called the Great, converted to Christianity in its Eastern Orthodox form in 988 on Crimea. And we'll come back to Crimea again a bit later on in its Putinist manifestation. And so they're at the heart of the concept of Holy Russia. So, set to one side your images of storm-tossed, freezing seas, raids on northwestern monasteries for one moment, and instead take your imagination to the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Volga, the Don, the western end of the Silk Roads. These are Vikings with a different perspective. It's the Eastern perspective, which brings us to the Eastern Way. Now, the East played a major part in the start of the so-called Viking Age as it impacted on the West, which exploded in the middle of the 8th century. Alongside various other causal factors, population growth in Scandinavia, cultural conflict with the expanding Christian Frankish Empire to the south, the beginnings of kingdom buildings in the northern homelands, and agricultural disruption due to volcanic activity, changes taking place in the distant Islamic Caliphate as the center of political power shifted from Damascus to Baghdad disrupted the flow of silver. So, a little bit of our geography here. So obviously here we have the Baltic, here we have the Scandinavian states, which didn't exist in that form at the time. These are geographical expressions. We're talking about Swedish Vikings, Norwegian Vikings, Danish Vikings, but these nation states did not exist for much of the period we're looking at. Denmark, kingdom building is happening in the 10th century. Norway lagging a little bit behind, but happening about the same sort of time, and Sweden maybe 150 years later. But basically, here we have the familiar Scandinavian homelands. We then have the river systems running through that will eventually take people to the Black Sea, and by portage from river system to river system, it's possible to eventually get to the Caspian Sea. And of course, having got to the Black Sea, we then can get to the Mediterranean. So the world in which we're looking at is this primarily this area here. This word here will come across later, Garthariki, which in Old Norse means the kingdom of the towns, is sometimes also called Gathar, the kingdom of the towns, the towns. And the towns, the trading settlements established by the Norse, will feature large in this story. But of course, down here, we have a very, very different world. We have nomadic tribes in the steppes, Pechenegs, Khazars, Kumans, Kipchaks, Volga Bulgars, who are converting to Islam at this time. We have people here, the Khazars, converted to Judaism. So we have quite an interesting cultural mix down here. And here we have the Abbasid Caliphate, an Islamic powerhouse, the Byzantine Empire, even though shrunk and reduced from its heyday of a few centuries earlier, is still very, very powerful indeed. So this is the kind of world that we're exploring. Now, basically, there was a massive disruption in around the 740s, 750s, when the power in the caliphate shifted from Damascus to Baghdad. And what that did was it disrupted the flow of silver north. And for years, that silver had reached northern Europe and was traded for slaves, furs, and amber. Facing this shortage of silver, raiding in the west offered Norse elites an alternative way to obtain precious metals and slaves. And at the same time, the forest products of the eastern Baltic and a supply of slaves from Slavic lands drew Swedish Viking adventurers eastward. So even in the West, many of the things that we associate with the Viking Age were stimulated by things that had happened a very, very long way away. And as I say, initially, it was disruption of silver from the caliphate because of internal problems here that caused a silver famine in Scandinavia. And silver was very, very important for gift giving, for the rewarding of followers, and so on. It was the precious metal of choice. And when it became rare, then it was sought elsewhere. Sometimes by trade, sometimes not. And the sometimes not, of course, is what is the most dominant form that we have in our imagination of the Vikings. But what it means is that the Viking Age always had an eastern front, a really significant eastern front, because utilizing the river systems, these Vikings, mostly Swedish Vikings, were soon active on the Black Sea, on the Caspian, and in the Byzantine Empire. As a result, from the year 800, things began to turn around again. As a result, from the year 800, vast streams of silver once again flowed north. So having been disrupted about a century beforehand and caused a lot of Norse to turn westward for getting silver, things settled down, the Abbasid Caliphate became much more stable, and once again, the silver flowed north. But the reason the silver flowed north was because other things were flowing south. Amber, furs, forest products, and people. People as chattel slaves. Vast numbers of people appear in this area of the world whose homeland is in this area of the world. And many of them are sold there by Norse who are now moving down through the river systems of Russia. And we know this because vast numbers, and I'm talking about tens of thousands of Arabic dirham coins, silver coins, have been found on the Baltic island of Gotland, up here, and in Sweden. Vast numbers of these coins. And they're testimony to the huge trade in people and things that connected Scandinavia with the Abbasid Caliphate and with Constantinople. And the revival of the flow of silver had a huge impact on Norse trading activities, including slave trading. We'll come across slave trading a little bit later on. And while this flow of silver appears to have once more slowed down in the 830s, due to renewed turbulence in the Caliphate, it picked up again between about 850 and 900, with a temporary slowing down again in the 880s. It slowed down again in the 970s before picking up again in the 990s and finally ended in about 1030. But for many, many years, the flow of silver north fueled the economies of Scandinavia. And it fueled a trading system which connected Scandinavia with the Silk Roads coming in from the east, as well as the Islamic Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire. And there are some striking examples of this. So, for example, the 13th century Icelandic saga of the people of Laxdæla saga, tells of an Irish princess captured in her teens who is sold to an Icelandic chieftain by a Rus merchant from what we now call Russia, operating on the Swedish island of Brunel. So did you get the geography of that? So this poor girl is seized somewhere off my map, right? She somehow becomes the property of a Rus trader, and we'll come on to why they're called Rus in just a moment. He then knows the main chance of getting a good price for her is in the Baltic, and he sells her to an Icelandic chieftain, and she then goes and becomes part of the Icelandic settlement that's going on at the time. Ireland, Russia, Iceland, the Baltic, all united in the story of one unfortunate girl who's seized as a prize, as a chattel slave. And it's an example of slave trading in this case, which united both the west and east of the Viking world. Incidentally, actually, the story is quite dramatic, actually. She pretends to be mute, and the husband only discovers that she isn't mute when one day he overhears her talking to their child, and realizing that the slave that he's now married, who's now his wife, who's become the mother of his son, actually can speak. And then the rest of the story sort of spirals on from there in the saga. And so she becomes one of the ancestors of a major player in Iceland in the following centuries. But the point is, she is, in her own life, she is an epitome of this quite extraordinary connectivity. While preparing for the Olympics in 2012, you may know that a very large mass grave was discovered on the Ridgeway between Dorchester and Weymouth. Something like 50 skeletons without heads, and not as many heads, so obviously somebody had taken some heads home as souvenirs. And when they did DNA and strontium testing on the skeletons, they found that almost all of them were young, fit men, most in their 20s and 30s. Almost all of them had grown up north of the Arctic Circle or in Scandinavia, but some of them, we think, had grown up in Russia. A Viking raiding party that went very, very badly wrong and was clearly summarily executed, beheaded, and their bodies were not discovered until the road was improved. If you know that road from Dorchester to Weymouth, it's now a much bigger, wider road than it used to be when I taught at Way Valley School in Weymouth many years ago, and they found this mass grave there. But the point was, it wasn't just that these young men came from Scandinavia, we think some of them came from Russia. And there they are turning up in Dorset. So, this is the world in which we are investigating. Now, so what written evidence? So there's some archaeology here, but obviously what written evidence do we have? Evidence for this Eastern Viking world survives on a number of rune stones. Now, you may or may not be familiar with rune stones, but rune stones are memorial stones. We have a lot of them in Sweden, elsewhere in Scandinavia, particularly in Sweden, and they are carved with runes. Now, runes are a northern Germanic, Scandinavian, but also used by other peoples as well, alphabet. We think it is inspired by the Latin alphabet in part, but it's much more angular and it's much easier to carve on stone or bone or wood. And so we have a number of these rune stones, some of them quite dramatic. This one here has a cross in it because clearly the people here are converted to Christianity. Sometimes we have a snake entwined and so on. But the key point is the runes that are on it commemorate people. And this is where we start to find the Eastern way showing up in a quite extraordinary way. An important one of these rune stones is located beside the driveway of Gripsholm Castle in Sweden. And when translated, it bears witness to an adventure that went terribly wrong a long way from home. And it reads, Tolla had this stone raised in memory of her son Haraldr, Ingvar's brother. Put a marker on Ingvar, okay? Ingvar's brother. They travelled valiantly, far for gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle. They died in the south, in Sörkland. Now, we're not talking here about an ornithological expedition that went out feeding the birds. What, of course, it's talking about is their body were fed on by the eagles, and it was in Sörkland. The Sörkland that's referred to on this and on 4 other runestones was the name used by Scandinavians for the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate and other Muslim areas of the East. The term was either derived from the word Saracen, so Saracen land, or from Sörkur, gown, referring to distinctive robes worn by Muslims living in the East. A similar Eastern dimension is revealed on the so-called Turinga runestone as well. And it reads, "These brothers were the best of the men, both in this land and abroad. And of one of them, he died in battle in the East, in Gavar, in Russia. But the runestone message that we just looked at from Gripsholm Castle, known today as SO179, is one of about 26 so-called Ingvar runestones that mention Ingvar. Most of them are found in the Lake Mälaren area of southern Sweden, specifically in the provinces of Södermanland, Uppland, and Östergötland. They're named from a Swedish Viking who was called Ingvar the Far-Travelled and who led an expedition to the Caspian Sea. And that single expedition is mentioned on more runestones than any other event in Swedish Viking history. The Ingvar expedition made a big impression. It indicates its importance to 11th century Norse communities. Other medieval evidence indicates, this time from Georgia, that Ingvar and most of his companions died in 1041, so relatively late in our Eastern Viking story. Some of them died in a fierce battle fought at Sasareti in Georgia, to the west of the Caspian Sea, which involved Byzantines, Georgians, and Scandinavian mercenaries. It was fought in a Georgian civil war. Those that didn't die in the battle itself later succumbed to disease far from Scandinavia. And these included Ingvar himself. He never made it home. Incidentally, and this is such a male perspective on life, the later sagas say, the diseases were sexually transmitted diseases that they caught from those foreign slave girls. So it's always women to blame, you see? Always women to blame. Typical to blame the women. But that takes us to the 12th century Icelandic saga called the Saga of Ingvar the Far-Travelled, which states that some Scandinavians made it back from the Caspian Sea to Russia, some survivors. Others travelled on to Miklagathor, the great city, the Scandinavian name for the great city of Constantinople, where Norse are frequently referred to in Byzantine written sources as both raiders and providers of mercenaries. So we can set to one side, the misogynistic thing that it was all the women to blame for the disaster. What basically happened was, the reality was, these people were campaigning very, very far from home, and things went very, very badly wrong in battle. But some also died from diseases, which probably they did not have immunities against. Back to Russia, some of them came. Back to Scandinavia, some to Constantinople. And in time, Viking sieges of Constantinople, and there were several sieges, gave way to more mutually advantageous trading arrangements, even if these were then tightly controlled by the Byzantine authorities. And some strange evidence, which some of you may have seen, survives from these Norse warriors who served in the imperial Varangian Guard, the bodyguard of the Eastern Roman Emperor. So we're talking about Norse swords for sale. So as well as traders, as well as settlers, young men are coming and selling their muscle. And they're selling their muscle to the Byzantine Empire, and they become part of the emperor's bodyguard, the Varangian Guard. And in the marble balustrade of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul can still be seen this rather curious runic inscription that some bored Varangian guard scratched with a knife or some other sharp instrument. We can't read it all, but in effect what it says is, Halfdan was here. Halfdan was here. And we assume Halfdan was a member of the Varangian Guard of the Eastern Roman Emperor. And the Varangian Guard will appear again in our story. So we know about them from Byzantine sources that write about the trouble they caused, but then also writes about the opportunities there were to recruit these people to fight in the Eastern Roman Empire for the emperor. But what about written sources from the Islamic Caliphate? In the late 840s, the director of posts and intelligence in the Baghdad Caliphate's province of Jabal in northwestern Iran, a man called Ibn Khordadbeh, recorded that he'd heard a group of newly arrived foreign traders who he called the Rus had brought merchandise to Baghdad on camels. Vikings on camels? Doesn't exactly fit the mental image, does it? According to intelligence reports recorded within the caliphate, because this man's job was to sift through intelligence reports and work out who was who and what was going on and feed it back to central government, he had heard that Rus traders had also been noted further east in Persia, and that some sailing through the Persian Gulf had reached lands described in his report written for the Caliph as Sind, India, and Al-Sin. There are debates over whether the last place named represented the western regions of Tang China or the Khaganate of the Uyghurs. Either way, they were a long way from Scandinavia. The route to the east took Norse traders as well as raiders very, very far from home. And when they went far from home, they connected up with the western end of the Silk Roads, which stretched all the way to Japan. And that's why we find artifacts as surprising as a statue of Buddha made in the Swat Valley of Pakistan being found in Sweden in early medieval contexts. The geography is quite extraordinary. We're almost certain it was made in the Swat Valley of Pakistan. It turns up in early medieval contexts in Sweden because of routeways that involve, for example, the Great Volga River routeway, which is a huge river routeway into central Russia that flows down to the Caspian and is where traders coming from a long way to the east will come and bring their goods for sale. And someone brought a little statue of Buddha, and someone thought that was interesting, and someone took it home to Sweden. Quite extraordinary. But we hear more about them as well, because an Islamic traveller also wrote an account of meeting Norse traders and slavers of the Rus on the river Volga in the first half of the 10th century. He'd been sent north on a diplomatic mission from the Caliphate, and he came across these people on the Volga. And this event, witnessed by the Islamic writer Ibn Fadlan, involved an account of the funeral of a Rus chieftain, shockingly also including the sacrifice of a slave girl. Here are the words of Ibn Fadlan about the people that he met on the Volga. Never did I see people so gigantic. They are as tall as palm trees and florid and ruddy of complexion. From the tips of their fingernails to the neck, each man is tattooed with pictures of trees, living beings, and other things, which would probably have been particularly shocking to an Islamic writer. He goes on. They are the filthiest creatures that God ever created. They do not wipe themselves after defecating or urinating, nor do they bathe after sexual relations or after eating. They are like wild asses. He's shocked by them, but he's intrigued by them as well. He's never met anything quite like these Scandinavian and their slave traders. He says, when the man, a Viking chieftain, had died, they asked his slave girls, "Who will die with him?" One of them answered, "I." The slave girl who had been devoted herself to death, meanwhile went back and forth, entering one after another of the tents which they had there. The occupant of each tent had sex with her, saying, "Tell your master, I did this only for love of you." That's him. Then they led her away to the ship, where an old woman called the Angel of Death strangled her. And she's stabbed as well. It's really shocking, but it reminds us of a very dark side of the road to the east as well, of slave trading alongside the amber and the silver. And huge numbers of men and women were traded that way. And Ibn Fadlan particularly writes about slave traders selling women. They would be Slavic women, maybe from the Balt tribes as well, very far from home, selling them on the banks of the Volga. So it's shocking. And this 19th century painting tries to sum up something of the drama, but also the dark shock of what Ibn Fadlan wrote about. But what this reminds us is, down the river systems of Russia and Ukraine, we increasingly are finding evidence of Norse settlement at places like Novgorod. We look at some of these places at the moment: Staraya Ladoga, Gorodiще, and Gnezdovo in Smolensk. And the last one, Gnezdovo, was an important trading site, larger than its equivalents in Scandinavia, such as Birka or Hedeby. And the presence is evidenced by culturally Norse artifacts, which we find in Russia. Now, while artifacts do not inevitably indicate ethnicity, you might drive a Japanese car, but you're born in Peasdown St. John, or whatever. Nevertheless, when we find them in such large numbers, at the very least, we are talking about Norse influence and probably Norse movement into the area. So many of these sites start to show culturally Norse artifacts. And we can see evidence for Norse travelers taking over or establishing key trading places on the river systems. So as I say, basically moving into this area, and we'll come across Novgorod, Staraya Ladoga, Belozero, and Izborsk a little bit later on. But we also know, for example, that settlements were being established around Smolensk as well. And culturally Norse artifacts are found there because clearly a lot of people are getting there from Scandinavia. And that, of course, brings us to the Norse and origin stories in Russia and Ukraine. The state of Kyivan Rus became hugely influential in Eastern Europe and generated its own origin myth. In the 12th century, the tale of bygone years was compiled in what is now Ukraine. It's now generally known as the Russian Primary Chronicle. And according to this account, Viking adventurers, who are called the Varangian Rus, used force to subjugate the Slavic and Finnish tribes living southeast of the Baltic. However, the chronicler claims they were then driven out. Varangian means something like those who swear loyalty, and it's a reminder that many of these people end up in the Varangian Guard of the Eastern Roman Emperor. Rus, it may mean rud. Notice the ruddy complexion that Ibn Fadlan spoke about. It may also be linked to an Old Norse or Finnish word for rowers, people that rowed boats. It may be linked to the Roslagen area of Sweden. We don't know why they were called the Rus, but this name, the Varangian Rus, become applied to these Scandinavian newcomers who are coming into this Slavic area of what we now call Russia. But, the story says, once free of the Rus, warfare broke out between the indigenous tribes, and they decided that perhaps the rule of the Rus wasn't so bad after all. Consequently, they invited them back to bring order. This is clearly later spin, designed to enhance the prestige and legitimacy of the later dynasty. They needed us. We are the only ones that can make the place run properly. This is obviously later spin, but it is very deeply woven into the story. And whoever wrote this interpretation of the mythical foundation of the Rus state was one who was clearly heavily invested in it. So although the spin was sharply patronizing in tone regarding the undoubted capabilities and reality of the indigenous Slavic and Finnish peoples, so it just dismisses that in a racist way, its purpose was to trace the arc of history in a providential way. It was to say, not only has this happened, but it's happened because it's the right thing to happen. It's the best thing to happen. So we're seeing spin here. And as a result, it was narrated in a way that revealed the good order brought by the newcomers, who would eventually be founders, of course, of the state, and crucially, converts to the Orthodox Christian faith. It was always meant to be so, is what the chronicler is saying. And the three brothers referred to in the story are, I mean, it could be any one of these, so I'll make my red pointer point at anyone that takes my fancy. First one is Rurik. So that's Rurik Shaul, you don't know. Who sets up shop in Novgorod. We'll look at where that is in a moment. We have this man here called Cineas, who sets up shop in Belozero, and Truvor in Izborsk. So what this basically means is, the story tells us that these people came, set up their little mini-states, and that Rurik set up a little mini-state based on Novgorod, okay? Cineas came to Belozero, which is right up here on the boundary of the Finnish tribes. And Truvor comes down here to Izborsk. The last two names may be Slavic versions of original Old Norse names, Sigjotor and Thorvar. Rurik, who was to give his name to the Rus dynasty itself, the Rurikid, represents a name that was originally something like Old Norse Horika or Rurik. Their return as rulers, the chronicler suggests, occurred sometime around 860, 862, but the dates are very fluid. When Cineas and Truvor died, Rurik amalgamated their lands, according to the chronicler, under his rule, and so was formed the nucleus of what would become the princedom of the Rus. And another source called the Novgorod Primary Chronicle, First Chronicle, describing events from 1016 to 1016 to 1471, and drawing in part on 11th century sources, also records this story of an invitation to foreign rulers to come and bring law and order. Now, while there are aspects of this account that are reminiscent of the foundation myths of several early medieval kingdoms, the evidence of archaeology and other written sources does point to an underlying reality of Norse expansion southeastward from the Baltic, which created these hybrid Norse-Slavic mini-states. The Russian Primary Chronicle also claims that while Rurik was establishing himself at Novgorod, two other Rus leaders named Askold and Dur travelled southwards and established their rule in the settlement later known in Russian as Kiev and Ukrainian as Kyiv. It's likely they took control of a trading post of the Khazars, who were already exploiting a favourable position on the Dnieper, Ukrainian Dnipro, river route to the Black Sea. Askold and Dur had travelled down the Dnieper, Ukrainian Dnipro, that major river. And if the Russian Primary Chronicle's dating is broadly correct, they set up two rival mini-states, Novgorod in the north and Kyiv or Kiev in the south. Rurik, we're told, ruled until about 879, and his successor named Oleg or Ole, a Slavic form of the Old Norse personal name Helgi, struck south and seized Kyiv in about 882, very fluid these dates, okay, and relocated his capital there. The Rus state is going to be centered on Kiev or Kyiv. The Russian Primary Chronicle says in doing so, he killed the other Norse chieftains and established his rule there. And from there, river routes led to the Black Sea through dangerous cataracts and facing raids by nomadic Pecheneg tribes. And the Swedish G280 Pilgard runestone reveals the dangers that the rivers could present. Hegborn raised this stone with his brothers Hrothvissel, Eystein, Emurdur. They have raised stones in memory of Hrafen, south of Rofstein, They travelled widely in Ifor, the name of the river rapids. So a number of Norse sources talk about these very dangerous rapids and cataracts on the major rivers that flow down to the Black Sea, which have to be crossed or have to be ported around, or you jump from river system to river system. But in this way, the new state of what would later be called, and is one of them, Kyivan Rus or Kyivan Rus was traditionally established, and it was enormous, and eventually it would stretch down to reach the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea itself. But it is a huge area, absolutely huge state, a huge polity. And it would last until the 1240s, when it fell to the Mongols. It became increasingly Slavic in culture, since the Norse were always a minority. However, connections with Scandinavia continued as reminders of the origins of key members of the founding generation of rulers, and show itself in all sorts of odd little events in history. Harald Hardrada, famous today because in 1066 he launched a bid for the Anglo-Saxon throne from his power base in Norway, and was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire in the early autumn of 1066, which of course was one of the reasons why Harold Godwinson, he of the arrow in the eye, was not on the south coast when the wind changed and William of Normandy landed on the south coast. He then has to force march back, and of course the rest, as they say, is history. And on Saturday, October the 14th, 1066, he dies at the Battle of Hastings. But Harald Hardrada, killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, had spent time amongst the Rus before he went back, made a play for the throne, and succeeded. Later saga sources talk about a love triangle involving him, various princesses, and the Byzantine emperor, that I don't think we need to have to believe, but clearly he's down there doing his, well, down there in fact, actually, doing his stuff. Later saga sources say he went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and with his military force secured the road from the Jordan to Jerusalem and freed it of bandits. Viking police activity in the Holy Land. Viking love triangle centered on Constantinople. Although the saga may have embellished certain parts of it, it's one more example, like the Irish princess, although she had no choice in her movements, Harald Hardrada did have choice, that connected up the Viking world. And there are other odd things as well. Between 1016 and 1042, England was ruled by the Danish royal family. Canute of Denmark conquered England in 1016, and this is very much overshadowed in popular memory by the Norman conquest of 1066. So most people have forgotten the Danish conquest of 1016, rather than the Viking conquest, rather than Norman conquest of 1066, which was longer lasting as well. But the key point is that when Canute won the kingdom, there were little children who were the heirs of the previous ruler, Edmund Ironside, who were dynastically something of a problem. So Canute sent them to Sweden, these are people he wants out of the way, with an order for them to be murdered by the King of Sweden. King of Sweden, according to later sources, balks at this and says, I'm not comfortable with this mission. They end up in Russia, they end up in Hungary. In the 1050s, one of them dies there, but one of them has children there as well. And in the 1050s, Edward the Exile and Edgar Atheling are brought back from Hungary as part of the succession options that are being played with by Edward the Confessor. But eventually in 1066, Edgar Atheling is too young, and there's a strong man already in a powerful position, and Harold Godwinson becomes king in January 1066, although he has no royal blood whatsoever. But the key point is, Edgar Atheling and his father, Edward the Exile, who dies almost as soon as he gets back to England, that family tree had come via Hungary, Russia, Sweden, and then England again. So there was a strange interconnectivity. And after 1066, many Anglo-Saxon warriors who knew they had no future in the world of the Normans sold their swords to the Byzantine emperor and went and joined the Varangian Guard, where they could kill Normans in Sicily. Different sort of Normans, but they weren't fussy. The point is the interconnectedness of the north with the east runs on and runs on. And the very last Rurikid, the dynasty claiming descent from the Viking Rurik to rule Russia, didn't die until the late 16th century. Then, following a time of extreme turbulence, the infamous Time of Troubles, the next Russian dynasty in the early 17th century, the Romanovs, manufactured connections with the older royal line, stretching back to the Norse founders of the Rus state. And Russian rulers have continued to reference these ancient roots as rulers of Muscovy sought to extend their authority south into what is now Ukraine. This expansion south was, they claimed, and still do, a gathering of the Rus lands. A gathering, and you can begin to see echoes here that we'll come back to in a few moments, which gave it added legitimacy. But before we do, though, another strange way in which the East echoed in the world of Scandinavia, where religious beliefs in Scandinavia mirrored the historical experience of the other. Because intriguingly, the East loomed as large in Viking Age mythology as it did in Viking Age economics and politics. The key source for this is a saga of the Yngling family, which looks at Swedish, then Norwegian royalty. And it's the first part of the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson's history of the ancient Norwegian kings, titled Circle of the World, Heimskringla. And the earliest part of this saga claims to deal with how the Norse deities, how the Norse gods and goddesses came to Scandinavia, how they reached Scandinavia, how they journeyed to Scandinavia. And in this section, intriguingly, it's explained that they originated in a part of Asia to the east of what is called the Tana-Govissel River. And from Snorri's explanation, this river is what we would now call the River Don. So basically, according to Snorri's account, Snorri Sturluson, the Norse gods originally lived in this area here before they moved to Scandinavia. Now, we're talking about putting a geographical fix on mythology. We're not talking about actually where anybody actually lived. But the point is, it's quite intriguing because it means that this area of the River Don is the original home of the Norse gods, according to Circle of the World. The River Don flows from south of Moscow to eventually reach the Sea of Azov, which is linked to the Black Sea, now in southern Russia and eastern Ukraine, bordering the Caucasus to the south. The region east of this was, according to Snorri, the location of the original city of the Norse gods. And the geography of this account in Ynglinga saga was clearly inspired by actual knowledge of strange lands in the east that had been explored by real-life Viking Age traders and explorers. And this knowledge was later reinvented in 12th and 13th century Norway and Iceland as a mysterious Never Never land, which was situated far, far away. And it's revealed in Snorri's account where the god Odin eventually embarks on a journey to Scandinavia, which is described as being via the Don and Volga rivers and through Garthariki, which of course was the Norse name for the kingdom of the towns, the old Norse name for the lands of the Rus. So what that means is Odin's claimed route to Scandinavia in the mythological story was in reverse the exact same route that actual people had travelled to the Islamic Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire. In other words, the Viking Age divinities were described as taking exactly the same river routes as real-life Norse traders of the 9th and 10th century. Norse mythology was made to mirror Norse history and experience, but in reverse. And it just reminds us, the East loomed large in the Norse imagination. Which brings us to a critical date. In 988, Vladimir, Ukrainian Volodymyr, Grand Prince of Kyiv in Russian, and ruler of the Rus, converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. This was a game changer and of immense historic importance. Later traditions say that he weighed up Islam, Judaism, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. And obviously we're having a rewriting of history, but maybe there was a great confabulation and debate and comparison. Later sources say he weighed them all up and in the end opted for Eastern Orthodox Christianity. One version says that those who came back, because one version says they came to him, one version says he sent emissaries out, so that his emissaries that came back from Byzantium, from Constantinople, said the incense, the color, the sound, the noise, we thought we were in heaven. Well, obviously that's written by a later Orthodox writer, but nevertheless, for one reason or another, probably also deeply indebted to the fact that the Norse of Kyivan Rus were now very much part of the trading settlements of Byzantium and were very much part of the geopolitical world of Byzantium. For one reason or another, probably several reasons, in 988, he opted for Eastern Orthodox Christianity. It allied the Rus with the Eastern Roman Empire. The great city itself, Miklagathor, Constantinople, Istanbul as now is. Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the drama, the color, the sight, the smells, the sounds, are now going to be part of the Russian story too. And it became known as the baptism of Rus. Vladimir let it be known that those who chose not to be baptized, he would consider to be his personal enemies. We believe there were a lot of people baptized. And today this ruler is celebrated in Eastern Orthodoxy as St. Vladimir, or Vladimir the Great, St. Volodymyr, Volodymyr the Great. And the 19th century statue of him above Kyiv, now shielded against Russian drones and missiles, declares this historic deep story. He's woven into the deep story of Ukraine. But he's also woven into the deep story of Russia. A contested deep story. There's some evidence that this movement towards orthodoxy had started in the time of his grandmother, Olga, Saint Olga, but Vladimir, and this is the lady here, but Vladimir is now central to the story as tradition remembers it. And the key point is, 988 is the start of this deeply emotive concept and mythology of Holy Rus, Orthodox and united. And Kyiv became the cultural center of this vast, now Orthodox, allied with the Byzantine world state. And remember, that was rooted in the actions of Viking adventurers, still celebrated in statues in modern Kyiv. If it ended there, it would be a dramatic story in its own right. But it doesn't end there, because it is a deeply contested legacy. After the destruction of Kyivan Rus by the Mongols in the 1240s, Russian rulers based in Moscow frequently referenced these Norse origins when trying to enhance their power and secure control of the Ukrainian lands, as rulers of Muscovy eventually expanded their area of control. This celebration of Muscovy, of Moscow, as inheritor of all that was meant by Kiev, or Kyiv the Golden, Orthodox and holy, became entrenched in support of Russian rulers' ambitions from the time of Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, in the late 16th century and onward. In Eastern Orthodoxy, there was a saying, two Romes have fallen, a third still stands, a fourth there cannot be. Two Romes have fallen, Rome and Constantinople to Islamic force in the 15th century. A third now stands, Moscow. A fourth there will not be. So the rulers of Moscow regarded themselves as inheritors of everything that Kyiv had and has now devolved upon their shoulders. You can see where this is going. Since the 18th century, though, the credit that foreign Viking incomers were accorded in this formation of Kyivan Rus, the golden age of Kyivan Rus was never in doubt, but the Norse origins has debated over time and changed over time, in line with changing Russian politics. This is sometimes termed the Normanist debate. So in the mid-18th century, foreign involvement in the formation of Russia became intellectually unacceptable. And German historians writing at the Russian court suddenly found they couldn't get their books published. Because foreign origins to the Russian state, I don't think so. However, it became more fashionable again in the late 18th and then 19th century as Tsars married consistently into German royal families and relished tales that Russia needed the strong hand of autocrats to keep it in line. Under Stalin, in the 1930s, promoting the idea of foreign founders of Russia would and did bring a death sentence, although he was highly critical of those who were dismissive of the decision of the Kyivan rulers to convert to Christianity, which is interesting given the fact that he was a materialistic atheist, because he said that orientated Russia to the West. And as a Marxist, he knew that Marx had said that it would be out of Western industrialization that eventually the dictatorship of the proletariat would emerge, etc., etc., etc. So under Stalin, it became very dangerous to say it was foreigners who had caused this to happen. But it also became equally problematic to say, oh, these Kyivan Rus, they were just rubbish. They were just superstitious. They were just has-beens because, now in the new glorious Soviet Union, because he said, don't diss them because what they did was impressive and worth building on. So they become part of a very curious legacy under Stalin. But the foreign involvement hardly helped that Hitler claimed, with predictable Nazi racism, if other people, beginning with the Vikings, had not imported some basic organization into Russia, the Russians would still be living like rabbits. What's intriguing is it's the same take as the Russian Primary Chronicle saying, we had to invite these people in to become our kings, and eventually they became rulers in the Orthodox fashion. But you can see that once more here, we have a Russian origin myth being deployed against the Russian people by a new Germanic invader. And you can see why foreign sources for Rus is highly dangerous at this point. During the Great Patriotic War, Ukraine suffered terribly at the hands of the Nazis. Early in the 1930s, it had suffered terribly at the hands of Stalin, as the millions who died during his collectivization campaigns, known as the Holodomor in Ukrainian, were followed by thousands of others in the Great Terror of 1936-38, as Ukrainian national culture and aspirations were hammered. But under Vladimir Putin, the wheel has turned again. The Russian origin story is central to his insistence. I'm not saying it's the only plank on it, of course it isn't. There's huge amounts of geopolitics and all sorts of things in there, but the Rus origin story is there centrally within his insistence that Russia and Ukraine are one people, with Moscow now the dominant force. In 2015, when Putin sought to justify his annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, he said this. And many people in the West would have been scratching their heads thinking, what? Crimea has sacred meaning for Russia like the Temple Mount for Jews and Muslims. And furthermore, Crimea is the spiritual source of the formation of the multifaceted but monolithic Russian nation. He added, it was on this spiritual soil that our ancestors first and forever recognized their nationhood. He was, of course, directly referring to the Christian baptism of the Rus ruler Vladimir the Great in 988. Now, the seizure of Crimea in 2014 involved more than just this, of course. But it reminds us that it wasn't just geopolitics and access to the Black Sea either. It was also rooted in a bitterly contested deep story of its place within Russian history and sacred geography. Now, how much Putin believes this, I do not know, but what I know is he articulates it again and again. The role of the ancient Rus within Putinism is revealed in other ways too. In 2016, a massive statue of Vladimir the Great of the Rus was erected in Borovitskaya Square in central Moscow. It is taller than the similar statue in Kyiv, and that's not coincidental. It was unveiled by Vladimir Putin. The erection of the statue was immensely controversial because St. Volodymyr, is claimed by both Russia and Ukraine as a founding father, and many Ukrainians considered it as a provocative gesture. And it was significant that the statue was unveiled on Russian National Unity Day, a national holiday revived by Putin in 2005. At the time, many Ukrainians felt the action was a deliberate attempt to challenge the idea of Ukrainian sovereignty and cultural independence, and wondered what would come next. In 2021, prior to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Putin once more referenced the ancient Rus as founders of a united state, a view which denied Ukrainian sovereignty, in his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Then, in 2024, February 2024, in conversation with the US conservative commentator Tucker Carlson, Putin explicitly referred to the Norse roots of the Rus as a way of claiming that Russia is now the legitimate heir of ancient European traditional culture, not the liberal West. The origin myth which Putin promulgated to Carlson was straight out of the medieval Russian primary chronicle. Putin said, in 862, the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian, a Viking, Prince Rurik from Scandinavia to reign. In the meantime, he had unleashed war on Ukraine in February 2022. This claim by Putin to represent European heritage in contrast to the West was further stated in June 2024 during Putin's Q&A with the academic Sergei Karaganov at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. As part of this, Putin made some revealing remarks concerning the relationship of Russia with Europe. He claimed, as for the elements of European culture, it is not we who are losing those genes and elements of European culture, but that part of Europe called Western. In this Putinist narrative, the Viking founders of the Rus, foreigners though they might be, have become very useful because they are a way of saying, we are Europeans. And we are now the true Europeans, the only ones who support European traditional values in the Putinist narrative. And in this narrative, the Viking founders of the Rus have been annexed to the latest expression of Moscow-based Russian nationalism and imperialism. So in conclusion, the Vikings of the East have been on a journey over time that is comparable to the immensity of their geographical journey in the medieval past. It's extraordinary that in the conflicted world of the 21st century, it is apparent that the journey of the Vikings of the East is far from over. Thank you.
Held us all sort of riveted, I think. Now, there is a brief 10 minutes or so for questions, if anyone has questions.
Feel free. Anything I didn't explain well enough, or was a bit confused, or anything, or just any spin-off question, fire away, and I'll do my best to answer.
I'll just ask you to talk directly into the microphone because we've got an online audience.
Thanks very much. Apologies if I've missed a subtlety here, but you've ended with quite a bit on Putin's sort of take on things. If you were Ukrainian,
yes,
what take would you be taking that would counter that?
That's a very good question. I mean, obviously, I would have to leave that to Ukrainians to say how it speaks to them. But my take on it is this, that the Ukrainian take on this is, yes, there is a common root, a common cultural root, a common thing that binds together, but that we are not prisoners of our past. And the Putinist narrative is, because we were once one people, we will be one people again, whether you want to or not. The Ukrainian narrative would be, yes, of course, there is this commonness. Kyivan Rus was once this huge area that united from the Black Sea to the Baltic. That it was something that brings us all together. The Eastern Orthodoxy, which itself has become hugely politicized and deeply divided since the invasion of Ukraine, I have to say. But the Eastern Orthodoxy is part of what unites us and gives us common culture. But Ukrainians undoubtedly would say that in the 13th century, something dramatic happened to this with the destruction of Kyivan Rus. And that what has emerged out of this is related language, related faith, related culture, but also divergence. But as importantly, I'm sure they would say, our experience of Russification over the 19th century and under Stalin and at other times too, makes us want to at times diverge even more. And I think this is the big problem, because are we prisoners of our history? Or do we have agency? And I think the Ukrainian argument would be, there is history here, of course there is, but we have agency to decide where we go with that history. Whereas the Putinist narrative is, you must come back as one. Now, of course, that obviously feeds into all sorts of other factors like fear of the Eastern movement of NATO, concerns about the EU Eastern movement, for example, Russian deep anxiety and resentfulness against the West, having sort of lost the Cold War and feeling that the West won the Cold War, as it were. His own need to use nationalism as a unifying force within Russia. He's very much linked to the Orthodox Church within Russia, for example. Now the Russian Orthodox Church has become very much a spokesman of Russian nationalism. So I'm not claiming for a moment, this is the only thing in the mix. But clearly, this is part of the Russian nationalist myth that we are all one nation and we must recognize that. The Ukrainian would be, we have a common history, but we can recognize something different. In the same way that Scots might say, if at some point in the future Scotland would become wholly independent, it would say, yes, of course, there's all sorts of connected, sometimes conflicted, sometimes harmonious roots. But we here and now, if it ever happened, have decided to do something different. And it's that matter of agency, I think, is the key point that is being denied. With sorry. Yeah. It's competing microphones now.
Yeah.
You got the microphone first, so it's yours.
Battle of mics now.
Battle of the mics, yes.
And much longer than the Vikings, the Rus, the Ukraine were actually part of, for example, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Yes.
Parts were belonging to Galicia. And what influence had this on actually on the thinking, especially the more now Western thinking of the Ukrainians? And comparing Putin with Khrushchev, for example, did Khrushchev have the same attitude former, referring, because after all he gave Crimea back to Russia and deported actually, to make this very complex, there's a question of the Crimean Tatars.
Yes, I know. Gosh.
What you brought in, it is a very nice, straight timeline.
Yes.
But there are so many twists and turns in this history that I think it's a little bit very bold to link that.
Yes.
And dictators have the tendency to get into mystical paths.
You're absolutely right. I mean, basically, what you've alluded to, the fact there is the history of Eastern Europe, and particularly of Southeastern Europe, is massively complicated. And that when Kyivan Rus collapsed and disintegrated, the southern lands of what we now call Ukraine became deeply contested. Like Poland, we have Swedes fighting there as well. We have Russian rulers contesting it as well. We have at one point, of course, you quite rightly say, this vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is this major force in Eastern Europe, which gathers up much of the lands that would once have been the western part of Kyivan Rus. That itself then collapses and is destroyed. In the book, I allude to a lot more of the complexity and say that obviously in the mix is a hugely complex cauldron of events. But the strange thing is, that through this kind of periodic return to, but how can we get cohesion out of this? How can we find sort of a common thread that runs through this? Often comes back to the origins of the rural kids, the origins of the Rus. And in some ways, this Eastern Norse connection is, if you like, kind of like a thread that runs through this. And obviously today, I focused on the thread, and that can give you a sense of purpose and clarity, whereas obviously the reality is immensely messy, immensely complicated. In Galicia, for example, are we talking about, is it Polish Galicia, Ukrainian Galicia? Is it independent in its own right? So in the book, I look at something called the massive complexity, but I'm aware of the fact that obviously it is massively complicated. But my main thesis is that time and again, people from both sides do still come back to but who are we? What are we? There's something about the rural kids, something about its original story that explains who we are and what we are. But you're absolutely right to make the point that it is a extremely turbulent, extremely complicated history. And Putin blames communist Russia for creating Ukraine and a concept as an independent state. So Putin, which has come as some surprise to the Ukrainians who suffered in the 1930s, but Putin will actually say Ukraine is an invention of the Soviet Union, and that when the Soviet Union collapsed, then it should all come back to Russia. Now, this is a very strange thing to say, I know, but this is a very strong thing in the Putinist narrative. And of course, many Ukrainians would say, so why was so much effort put into Russification in the 19th century if there was nothing here that needed to be Russified? There we go. But the Putinist narrative is a complicated one, and you will find it from time to time say that the USSR, by allowing Ukraine to be a Soviet socialist republic, by Khrushchev giving Crimea to Ukraine in the 1950s, because he thought the USSR had gone forever and ever and ever and ever, and to some extent it didn't really matter who Crimea belonged to, because fundamentally it belonged to the USSR. But when it all fell apart in 1991, he would say things then happened that were never envisaged and should never have taken place. And I do look also a little bit at the complicated history that happened after 1991 as well, that led us to today. But you're right to remind us of the complexity, the turbulence and the difficulty of it. It's just that, like a drumbeat, referring to these origins occur again and again and again. And it's quite intriguing that after all the turmoil of the 1990s, Putin has decided this is a quarry worth working at in order to try to create an image of why Russia is but one country, one Orthodox country, and Ukraine is not legitimate, which would be fiercely contested by Ukrainians and is even as we speak.
In 1648, which is a date which coincides with Westphalia but has nothing to do with it, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth recognized the Cossack Ukrainian state as independent.
Yep.
And a great deal of fighting took place after that, including recruiting Crimean Tatars from the Ottoman Empire to fight on their behalf, and they proceeded right up as far as Kiev. Do the Ukrainians not make anything of this fight for independence, this recognition that in the 17th century they fought very, very hard for their independence?
They certainly did. I mean, you're referring to the Zaporizhian Hetmanate, which was this Cossack state. Cossacks aren't an ethnic group. Cossacks are basically people who've often runaway serfs, people who want to get a new life on the frontier, who want to be free of Tsarist control, etc., etc. So Cossacks are more of a group of people who want their freedom and their independence in the 17th century than actually an ethnic group. But you're right, in the 17th century, we have this Cossack state, which is one of the many kind of iterations and complex forms that emerge out of the disintegration of Kyivan Rus. And then in the 1650s, the Cossack hetman puts himself under, and Putin quoted this to Carlson, and you can see Carlson thinking, I have no idea what you are talking about. The date is 1654, I believe. And he says, in 1654, I've got the document in the archives. You can see Carlson thinking, oh dear, he's going to go and find it. Because in 1654, this Cossack state, under pressure from the Poles, under pressure from other areas of the Ottoman Turks as well, puts itself under the protection of the Russian Tsar, and it seems pretty clear that they regard themselves as being a marriage of convenience that won't necessarily last forever, and we've got the Tsar as an ally, but the Tsar regards that as being, this is effectively your acceptance of the legitimacy of Russian rule, and it's that then becomes the big push under Catherine the Great, for example. It's her that annexes Crimea in the 1780s. And this is where history becomes so contentious. So Putin says, there you go, that's when Russia agreed to Ukraine agreed to join, and they're in. At the time, the Cossacks would have said, no, this is more of a marriage of convenience. It might last, it might not last. But even if it was
more like a NATO arrangement, wasn't it?
Yes.
We will fight together.
Absolutely, we'll fight together, exactly. But even if it was that meaning in the 16th, 17th century, it's not the 17th century anymore. And I think this is a challenge for all of us who are passionate about history, that history gives us a great deal of our boundaries, it shuts down an awful lot of our options, it decides a great deal of our character. But I would say we are not prisoners of our history. We have agency. And I think it's a battle of agency that's going on in Crimea today, as much as it is a battle of horrific military violence as well. But you're right, and this, of course, links back to the complexity that you were saying of this very, very complex area in which Crimean Tatars are involved, who were then, of course, expelled en masse by the Soviets after the Second World War for alleged collaboration with the Nazis. It's a messy history, but a fascinating one. But thanks for reminding us. Yeah, the Zaporizhian Hetmanate of the Cossacks in the 17th century.
Okay, this probably will have to be the last question before.
I'm aware it's very hot, and you've been really so polite and attentive for what's been a very warm evening. I do appreciate that.
What language were the Rus, the Vikings that went down into Russia, what did they continue to speak their own Nordic languages, or did they become Russian?
Very good question. They would originally have spoken Old Norse. Basically, this language, which in one form or another is spoken right across Scandinavia. It comes in different dialects and forms. So to start with, they would have been speaking Old Norse. And the earliest generation are clearly name-giving in Old Norse. So even though we see them in Slavic forms in later Slavic chronicles, it's quite clear they're giving each other Old Norse names. By the time of Vladimir the Great in the late 10th century, the state is becoming increasingly Slavic. And it reminds us that the Scandinavian Rus were always a minority. They were always a minority in a much larger population of extremely active, capable, skillful, intelligent, resourceful people. And what eventually emerges is a hybrid Norse-Slavic state, and eventually it's a Slavic state. So by the time that Kyivan Rus falls to the Mongols in the 13th century, we are in all intents and purposes talking about a Slavic state which has had an interesting Nordic input into some of its formative origins, just as you look at Normandy in a lesser sense and say, it's pretty French, really, but originally it had a significant Norse input. Or the north of England, where we'd say there's a real big input of Norse into this area, but it's a hybrid English-Norse state, even more so in the east, where the Norse were even smaller minority. So certainly by the time of the 12th, 13th century, we are talking a Slavic state, with all its rulers giving their children Slavic names, and very, very few Norse words make their way into modern Ukrainian or Russian, which tells you something about the greatness of the change, because the Norse are nothing if not chameleons.
Yeah, it just seems surprising that the Norse who went to Normandy very quickly took to French.
Yes.
But then they came over to England and they stuck with French for ages.
Yes, I think it's because it's a way in which you identify your separateness from those who you've conquered or controlled, and I think in this country, it was a way of, they were sort of saying that we are we, you are you. But in the end, eventually, but you're right, it's not till the middle of the 14th century that Parliament conducts its business in English, for example, so it's quite intriguing, really. The Norse in the East become Slavic much faster, I would say within a couple of generations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Because I think they're such a minority in such a huge, huge area with such a huge population.
Okay, well, I think we can thank Martyn again, because this really was very interesting. And there is his book, which will, in fact, I'm sure it will talk about all of these odd little twists.
Yeah,
and turns.
it looks much more areas that I've just skated over tonight. You're quite right to point us to. Quite right to.
Right. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.